your boy King Say So, and I'm back. Before we get to it, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Make sure you watch the full video. With all that being said, let's get right to this thing.
Most people don't agree on many things in regards to the criminal justice system, but even amongst all the disagreements that exists on this subject, there's one thing that can't be argued, and that's the fact that some people deserve to be locked away for their heinous crimes. Around the world, there are criminals who have been, or currently are, locked up for some of the worst crimes known to man. We're going to explore 10 criminals who are currently locked up and why they're considered the most dangerous inmates. Eileen.
No, it took you 12 months.
Yeah, and that's a hell of a lot of men I went through before the next jerk came along and I used protection, like a condom.
Nico Jenkins. If you don't know the name Nico Jenkins, you might recognize the face of this violent killer. Nico Jenkins should be known by many, considering his face went viral in 2019 for his menacing look. Unfortunately, few seem to know about his crime. From a young age, Jenkins had a rough life. His family were neglectful, had drug addiction problems, and were also involved in a life of crime, having robbed and murdered all over Omaha, Nebraska. Early on, the signs were there. He'd been detained for taking a gun to his school at the age of 7, was carjacking at age 16, and while in prison, engaged in numerous riots and acts of violence against guards. In 2013, he murdered 4 people, all within the space of 10 days. One of his victims he'd met in prison, while the other 3 had no relation to Jenkins whatsoever. He shot his victims in the head, back, face, and in one case, in the groin. He was arrested soon after on unrelated charges of terroristic threats. Then, evidence was found to link him to the violent killing spree in the 4th Street area. The reason behind the murders? Well, Jenkins stated that they were sacrificed to the ancient Egyptian deity Apophis. He revealed this in an 8-hour interview. He pled guilty to his crimes and linked his crimes to a crippling mental illness. Regardless of his reasons, Jenkins was sentenced to a death by a 3-judge panel. He was also sentenced to 450 years in prison on weapons charges. He's made an effort to appeal this decision.
450 years. Really? That always be like mind blowing when they be giving out these type of numbers. Like, bro, this sentenced the person to life and call it a day. What did you put on 1,000 years? Come on, man.
But the United States Supreme Court refused to even hear the case. The real Typhoid Mary. This is one of the most interesting cases of a truly dangerous prison inmate. You've likely heard the term Typhoid Mary at least once in your lifetime. Did you know that it's actually based on a very real person and a very serious disease that she carried unbeknownst to the people around her? To understand the story of Mary Mallon, we have to head back all the way to the early years of the 20th century. Mallon immigrated to the United States in 1883 and lived in New York City in 1900. She was a maid serving homes across New York City and Long Island. From 1900 to 1907, over 24 people fell ill with typhoid fever. The connection? Mary Mallon. She worked at the homes of all the people who'd fallen sick. Unfortunately, nobody knew where Mallon was. By the time they traced it back to her previous home employment, she'd vanished. And they didn't link it to Mary Mallon. Not yet, at least. In 1906, Mallon worked at a home where 6 of the 11 residents contracted typhoid. The family hired George Soper, a New York City Department of Health sanitary engineer, to investigate the outbreak. Mallon wasn't indicated as the reason for the outbreak. Instead, this typhoid outbreak specialist believed it was contaminated water that caused it. Soper would eventually get to Mallon when another outbreak, this time in 1907, in a Park Avenue Manhattan home, resulted in death. He linked all the cases to her, and she fled, but was quickly apprehended and sent to an isolation center in the Bronx. She was released when the health department ruled she could be free, but couldn't work with food. It was 4 years later when Soper would be looking for Mallon again after another outbreak in a hospital in Manhattan and a sanatorium in New Jersey. It was discovered she'd been a cook in both places. She was caught again and sent back to the isolation center, where she remained until her death. She was linked as the primary cause of 3 deaths and countless others she'd indirectly contributed to over the course of her time as a servant in New York City. She became infamously known as Typhoid Mary, the carrier of dangerous pathogens. However, she herself was immune to the complex disease. and her death was instead the result of a paralytic stroke in 1932, which slowly killed her for 6 years until her ultimate death in 1938. Andre
Wow,
Red
bro.
Ripper Chikatilo. A true monster, Andre Chikatilo was better known by many in Russia as the Butcher, or more commonly, Red Ripper. His crimes began in 1978 when he lured a 9-year-old girl to a home he'd purchased. He attempted to assault her, but after unsuccessfully garnering a full erection, he instead murdered her. He'd continue finding and killing multiple young women throughout the 80s all around Russia. His crimes were well known for the horrific details, which many couldn't stomach repeating. In 1990, a 38th victim of the Red Rippers was found in a woodland area near the Donleskov station. An officer in charge of the station had seen Chikatilo there the night he'd murdered Svetlana Korstik, not that he was aware of it at the time. He did notice Chikatilo's strange behavior and the fact that his story wasn't checking out. He claimed to be there for mushroom harvesting, which was a popular pastime in Russia. However, the officer noticed his formal attire and the blood on his cheek, an intense wound on his finger, and just couldn't seem to make sense of any of it. Ultimately, he let Chikatilo go, but when he was questioned about his night at work and if he'd seen anything strange, they managed to narrow down the suspects to Chikatilo, who'd already been arrested once before in connection to the first murder in 1978. They now had what they needed to begin reeling in this dangerous criminal. He'd have 2 more victims before finally being arrested in November 1990. They wanted him to confess to make it airtight, considering most of their evidence was circumstantial. They eventually managed to get a DNA confirmation that Chikatilo's sample matched the same found at one of the most recent crime scenes. On November 29th, a psychological profile was done on Andrei Chikatilo, where he eventually confessed to everything. He was sentenced to prison for the murder of 52 victims in total, but 9 were reversed by the Russian Supreme Court for a lack of evidence. He faced the death penalty, ultimately dying.
See, like, people like him, that's why you can't judge a book by its cover, bro. Again, like, he don't even look like someone that'll be out here doing wild type of things, and bro out here taking people's life.
In February of 1994.
Except right there, he looked crazy right there.
Ed, the co-ed Butcher Kemper III. From a young age, Ed Kemper III displayed sociopathic tendencies. As a child, he was an avid pyromaniac, enacted murders with his sister's dolls, tortured animals before killing them, fantasized about being put to death by the electric chair, and was even locked in a basement by his mother, who believed he might sexually assault her youngest daughter. At age 13, he ran away and went to his father, but found he'd moved on, remarried, and now with a stepson who had his full attention. He'd returned to his mother before living with his grandparents in North Fork, California. In 1964, he killed his grandmother, whom he didn't get along with. He proceeded to kill his grandfather. He called his mother, telling her what he'd done before calling the police and waiting for them to arrive. He was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and put under supervision in a mental facility. He was released at the age of 21, 5 years after his violent crimes. Psychologists argued this was a mistake, and boy, were they right on the money. In his first few years as a free man, he got a few jobs, made some friends, and wanted to become a police officer that was above the height requirements. He eventually saved enough money to move out of his mom's place and into a place with a roommate. Eventually, things didn't pan out, and he was right back where he started, with his mother. In 1972, on March 7th, he officially started a life of being a serial killer, killing 2 women. Over the course of 9 months, he'd kill 4 more. He eventually killed his mother after an argument. He mutilated her body, severing her head and using it to pleasure himself. Unsatisfied, he invited her friend over and killed her too. Then he drove away and kept driving for 4 days before calling the cops on himself. He attempted to plead insanity, but was denied. With the death penalty suspended in California at the time, he was denied his dream execution. All his victims, besides his family and his mother's friend, were students he'd pick up at the side of the road before taking them to isolated areas where he'd kill them, mutilate them, and perform sexual acts with their severed heads and corpses. To this day, he remains behind bars, convicted of 8 murders and 8.
And he couldn't become a police officer because of a height requirement. A height requirement stopped him from being a policeman. Look how crazy this dude is.
Life sentences. Thomas Terrible Tommy Silverstein. Probably one of the worst examples of an inmate bad to the bone is none other than Thomas Silverstein, better known as Terrible Tommy. His story is unique, as he became a dangerous inmate while in prison. Before even becoming a killer, Thomas Silverstein was nothing more than your typical armed robber from California. His first run-in with the law was at the age of 19 in 1971, where he spent 4 years in prison before getting out on parole, only to land right back in prison not long after due to a string of armed robberies in 1977. He was then sent to prison for 15 years, and it was all for $11,000, which he stole with his father and cousin. This is where the story takes a dark turn. While out in the real world, Silverstein, to our knowledge, wasn't a killer. While at a state penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, that would change. While there, he made friends with a neo-Nazi prison gang known as the Aryan Brotherhood. In 1980, he'd be charged and sentenced to life without parole for the murder of fellow inmate Danny Atwell, who'd refused to be a drug mule for the gang. Things didn't stop at Danny Atwell, though. Silverstein was moved into a control unit designed for difficult-to-manage criminals. In 1981, he'd be accused of murdering Robert Chappell, who was a member of another prison gang known as the DC Blacks. However, Silverstein maintains his innocence in connection with Chappell's murder. The leader of the DC Blacks was moved into the same control unit as Silverstein and attempted multiple times to murder him, but Terrible Tommy got to him first, stabbing him 67 times. Terrible Tommy ended up murdering corrections officer Merle Klutz in 1983 after being let out for a shower. He stabbed him multiple times after pushing him against another cell and getting the knife from Randy Gometz, a prisoner on the other side. He'd returned to Leavenworth in Kansas, where he served for his armed robbery crimes in the late 70s in solitary confinement for 18 years, before being transferred for the final time, along with Gometz, to the newly formed Supermax prison in Colorado. An interesting fact is that Tommy Silverstein is one of the reasons why Supermax prisons even became a thing in the United States of America, designed to hold the most violent offenders. Terrible Tommy died on May 11th, 2019, at the age of 67.
Like, hold on, like, look at his face, like, look, like, he don't even
Supermax
look like
prisons
that type of
even
dude,
became
bruh.
a thing in the United States of America, designed to hold the most violent offenders. Terrible Tommy died on May 11th.
Like, look at him, bruh. Look like probably the most common person ever. If you need $1, he gonna give you 10. If you need a ride, he gonna take you wherever you need to go. No charge, no gas. Boy, man.
2019. At the age of 67, he spent more than 36 years of his life in solitary confinement
bruh.
for his multiple crimes while behind bars. These criminals felt little remorse, if any, for their actions. They'd spent years finding victims, coming up with plans on how to get rid of people, and ultimately paid the price for their crimes. Although, yes, you might disagree with certain practices of the law, these are some of the cases where unanimous consensus should be reached. Our world was better off having these dangerous members of society behind bars for the rest of their lives.
Facts, man. Facts. It might be a lot of bad prisons out here, and for sure it's a lot of people that's in jail for a long time or even for a short time that don't deserve to be there. But we for sure need jails because it's some people, bruh. It's either you got two options: put them in jail or in their life. Come on, as human beings, we don't want to be super cruel, so put them in jail. At the end of their life, that's kind of, you would hope that like a X amount of time of a person being in jail, that they will learn from their mistakes and then hopefully come home, or just learn from being evil and then try to be good. But it don't go like that. They are still, like, look at these people right here. Got out, still came home, did the same thing. Went to another prison, still did the same thing. Like, some people gotta be locked away, bruh. No matter what, bruh. Some people, not all, but some people gotta be locked away or go in their life. What would you choose? Catch you next one.